I see myself as a bridge builder. I mean, that's something that I actively try to do, but not in a way that then compromises my core beliefs. I mean, I believe strongly in taking up your cross and counting the cost of that.
Yeah.
What is it to gain the whole world but forfeit your soul? So,
Yeah.
I will try to be faithful to what I believe, but I'm also willing to engage in dialogue and want to engage in dialogue with people that have very different points of view than me.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and or listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, which is a Facebook Live event, I guess you could say, also a podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, where podcasts are available. And today I'm talking with Adam Russell Taylor, who is an author and also the new president of Sojourners. And I've got a copy of his book here, which I picked up at the Wild Goose Festival this summer. So Adam, I'm going to talk about you and introduce you properly. But first of all, just welcome to my podcast, my conversation. And tell me, first of all, how long have you been president of Sojourners? When did you take over?
Yeah, so thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. It'll be a year in November. So okay. I'm not sure when the honeymoon period ends.
Yes.
Although I figure if you take over for someone who's been leading the organization for almost 50 years, a year doesn't feel like very long.
Right. And founder. So let me tell folks a little bit about who you are. President of Sojourners and author of another book before A More Perfect Union, which was Mobilizing Hope. Is that correct?
Right. Yes.
And you have been reading about you a little bit. You seem to have been in the kind of faith / NGO / justice, peace, hope, religion, spirituality work for a long time. When you were at the School of Foreign Service, what were you studying? Because I know you were at Harvard for a while before you got into all this. What was your actual field of study?
Yeah, so I studied public policy at the Kennedy School of Government and had actually a concentration in international development. A lot of my passion and work has been both about kind of fighting for human rights and fighting poverty around the world, and a lot of work to try to advance racial justice and economic justice here in this country.
Yeah.
But then later I experienced a kind of call to ministry. I wrestled with that for a while because I didn't feel called to be a pastor of a church, but I did feel called to try to engage and enlist the church more in a greater commitment to justice. And so in about 2006, I started seminary at the Proctor School of Theology. And this is actually when I was working at Sojourners, the first time I was on staff as a senior political director, and then got my master's in divinity degree and got ordained in 2009.
When you first found out about Sojourners, what was the context? In other words, there must have been a time in your life when you never heard of these guys, and now you're president of this outfit. What was your first introduction, and how did that all unroll? And when was it, and where was it?
Yeah, so it felt kind of providential. I kind of lament that I didn't discover Sojourners until graduate school. It was really because of a course that Jim Wallace, who's the founder of Sojourners, was teaching as adjunct professor at the Kennedy School on the intersection of faith and politics. And literally you only get one elective class your first year at the Kennedy School. So you got to choose it really wisely. And there's so many different courses that were piquing my interest. But a friend of mine kind of convinced me that I absolutely had to take this class with this guy, Jim Wallace. And so I took a step of faith and signed up, and the class was incredible. It connected the dots around so many things I was passionate about, struck up a kind of relationship that turned into a friendship with Jim. And then he asked me to be a TA for his course my second year. And then I graduated, started a nonprofit called Global Justice, and he asked me to join the board of Sojourners. So it kind of started this very, long but formative journey with me kind of sojourning with the organization before I became president.
And when would you have joined the board?
So I first joined the board back in like 2001.
Okay.
And, it was on and off the board a couple of different times. And then actually ultimately became chair of the board. I became Jim's boss for a couple of years, which was fun. And then really the 2016 election was kind of a real turning point in my own discernment. And I tell the story in the book, but there was, we all can kind of remember back to the morning after the election. And my then 5-year-old son, Joshua, came into our room at 3 a.m. and we hadn't been able to sleep that night and was like, Mommy and Daddy, I need to know who won the election. And we really tried to shield him from the election, which is kind of impossible in DC. But we were like, well, we think Mr. Trump won. And his exact response was, I don't understand how someone who has done and said such mean things could win.
Yeah.
And I was just speechless. I literally felt such turmoil and such anguish, not because our country had elected a Republican or someone that's more conservative than me, but literally elected someone who had managed to exploit and stoke so many of the worst impulses and demons in our country of racism and misogyny and xenophobia.
Yeah.
And that was kind of a breaking point. I realized that I couldn't stay in my position at the World Bank. I was doing very meaningful work, leading a whole faith initiative at the World Bank Group. But I felt like I needed to get back into the struggle for our democracy and for the kind of soul of our country. And so I rejoined Sojourners as the executive director. Jim and I then went through some really important, great years of transition together as kind of, he is president, me as executive director. And then I formally became president in November.
Because let's see, Jim's how old now?
He is early 70s. I should know his exact age, but
yeah, because I'm going to be 70 next year. And I think I first met him, maybe I was 15, and he came out to visit my dad, Francis Schaeffer, in Switzerland at L'Abri, the ministry my parents started. I've known Jim since I was 15, basically on and off. But the funny thing is, in the time since after I met Jim, it was at L'Abri at that time. If someone had come to L'Abri, they would have said it's sort of a fundamentalist evangelical hippie commune. So Jim showed up at that phase, and then with, sadly, a lot of pushing from me, sort of out of greed and ambition and career-wise, having become my dad's nepotistic sidekick in the 70s and gotten him into the religious right really via taking a, quote, stand on the human life issues with the film series that I wrote and directed, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, that Dr. C. Everett Koop featured in. In the years that followed that, as we kind of moved to the right, and Jim kept doing what he was doing in terms of Sojourners, Ron Sider, other people like that who were friends of ours, there was this incredible rift. So for a while, we would have regarded Jim, Wallace, Sojourners, folks like that kind of as the enemy of what we were doing, although, that was illogical because Jim was never all about that anyway. But many years later, obviously, after I took my own journey out of that evangelical right-wing world and became something completely different, on a human and spiritual level and career-wise as well, no longer in the big-time God business and very far from it as a novelist and writer. Then Jim and I sort of met as co-belligerents on a lot of issues and places. And after that, I followed him with great affection and the work of Sojourners. So, the first thing I want to say now, we've got a little relaxing, chit chat out of the way, is I'm so glad Jim's found someone that he loves as much as he loves you to take over the work, because Jim is so fond of you. When I talked to him this summer down at Wild Goose about how everything was going, you leave a trail of very goodwill behind you, which is good. And because of that, you obviously have a very warm personal relationship with these guys, because it's the same with the staff. They speak of you so warmly, which is great. So now I want to turn the page before we get into the book itself, which I have marked several passages to read here that I like. I'll show them to you. It's dog-eared and so on. I really did read it. I want to talk about your personal life a little bit and forget the work and forget the education and everything. You have a 5-year-old. Who else is in your family? The people that count most to you, who are they these days?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, so I have to start with my wife, Sheree. She grew up in Jamaica and then in Toronto, Canada. Actually, literally just became a U.S. citizen about 2 months ago. So celebrated that. And she's a lawyer kind of by training, but now kind of works at Consumer Reports. And my 5-year-old son that I mentioned, Joshua,
let me just
10.
go back to Sheree a minute.
Yeah.
Where did you all meet and how long ago was that?
So funny enough, we met in church at Union Baptist Church when I just finished my graduate degree at Harvard, and she was just finishing her law degree at Boston College. And I had just gotten not ordained yet, but I had become licensed in ministry. And so kind of brand new to ministry. We met in the basement of the church in kind of a young adult Bible study, and we were paired up together and just immediately kind of hit it off. And then I had to go up. I wasn't preaching that day, but I was sitting with the ministers, like which often happens in Black churches, and all the ministers sit around the pulpit. And so I'm looking at the congregation, and she's literally sitting there in the middle, and I could not stop staring at her. And her friend was like, "Is that minister staring at you?" It just was not the best protocol of behavior, but nonetheless,
it was a good kind of staring.
Exactly, it was a good kind of thank you. I'll claim that. So yeah, we started dating after that, and 3 years later got married. So
that's great.
Yeah, she's definitely my anchor. And then my 5-year-old son is now 10, so he's 5 in 2016. Joshua, and my other son is 8, Nathaniel, and they're both, wonderful, very athletic. I'm their soccer coach, which I hugely enjoy.
That's good.
And we live just outside of DC in Silver Spring, Maryland. I'm also active in ministry at Alfred Street Baptist Church, which is not anywhere close to Silver Spring. It's in
And is that
Alexandria,
where you go? You and your family go to that church?
We do. I mean, sadly, because of COVID, it's been closed down, and we're hoping it can reopen in November. But yeah, that is our home church, and really, love the pastor, Howard John Wesley, and it's just an amazing church. So
when you met your wife, did you and she have similar backgrounds in the sense that, first I'm going to ask you about your background. Do you come from some sort of religious background that shadows where you are now, either a journey to or from? And did she as well? Because you're meeting in a church, but I just wonder what sort of homes you all grew up in. Talk about your wife first. What sort of a home did she grow up in?
So my wife grew up Christian. She's got a very gigantic family, and my father-in-law has 8 siblings, and they were a very devout Seventh-day Adventist family.
Oh, okay.
And then my mother-in-law grew up Catholic, and then kind of left the Catholic Church and started going to different mainline churches.
Yeah.
And so, I think my wife has certainly been influenced by all that, but I think certainly by the time I met her, she was very much a kind of Protestant Christian and had been going to a couple of different Black churches, and then ended up at Union Baptist Church where we met.
Did she sort of have a moment when she moved out of the Seventh Adventist tradition, or was it kind of an evolutionary step, or did she one day just say, this is not where I want to be for whatever reason, and sort of say goodbye? Was there a family split because of that, or was it just a transition?
Yeah, so she was never really that involved in the Adventist church, mainly because my mother-in-law is more religious than my father-in-law. So it was more of a departure from the Catholic church. And I think there was kind of a moment where they both kind of decided to leave. And then on my side, my parents, we were really young, we went to a Presbyterian church, and then we ended up discovering.
What kind of a Presbyterian church was that? Sort of
Presbyterian USA,
more reformed or less, more evangelical, more. How would you have looked at that?
It was a reformed church, and I only have kind of vague memories because I was very young when we were active in that church. The church that really I think helped form us in our spiritual religious walk was the First Congregational Church of Bellingham, Washington. So we joined a very vibrant congregational church. Had an amazing, very thoughtful, very smart minister, pastor. And my dad got really involved in the choir. My mom really got involved in the youth group. I was very involved in the youth group, not just at the church, but also kind of, nationally. And that was where I really kind of experienced fellowship in a much deeper way and experienced the love of Christ in a very profound way. And so, what part of my story is that my mother's Black and my father's white, and they got married in 1968, same year Dr. King was assassinated, only a year after interracial marriage was legalized around the country through Loving versus the state of Virginia. And they instilled in me this really deep and abiding belief that, one, my diversity in a larger sense, our nation's diversity is a strength, not a weakness.
Hmm.
And then they instilled in me the sense that my generation, Generation X, inherited the unfinished business of the civil rights struggle. So I'm mentioning that just because I became very infatuated with the civil rights movement from an early age. And so by the time I got to high school, I became just really convinced that I wanted and needed to go to school and kind of trace some of the history of the civil rights movement. And so I ended up applying to Emory University, was able to get a scholarship. And so I went to Emory in Atlanta, and literally the first Sunday I was there, I made a pilgrimage to Ebenezer Baptist Church, the spiritual home of Dr. King, heard just an amazing sermon that weaved together a commitment to, a deep personal relationship with Christ with a deep commitment to justice in the world. And I joined that same Sunday. And then a few months later, I ended up volunteering at the Dr. King Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta. And so, that really cemented this kind of connection to the civil rights movement. And, that's part of what inspired me to write this book.
Yeah, and I'm going to get to the book in a second here, and I want to talk about it and what it's about. I just want to ask you an interesting question. This is just totally changing gears here. Let me just remind people you're listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Adam Russell Taylor, who is the president of Sojourners. He's got a new book out, which we're going to talk about a little bit here, A More Perfect Union, which I've read and marked some passages I want to read to him. I don't know why I read stuff to an author, but he knows what's in it, but I'm going to ask him about it. Sure. Before I do that, though, I have an interesting question for you that I think changes the subject completely. How do you, as president of Sojourners, coming from the background you come from, and obviously someone who has a very vibrant faith now and has for a long time, deal with people like me who come out of an evangelical background almost like refugees now? I describe myself as an atheist who believes in God, and we can unpack that a little bit sometime, but this is, an interview where I'm interviewing you, but you sort of get an idea maybe from that terminology that I look back on my journey of faith as one that's uncomfortable, a learning experience, a lot of rejection of past things that I feel were real mistakes. And now a lot of sorrow looking at the storming of the Capitol by people who were inspired by a lot of the evangelical work that not just my family did, but many of the people that we worked with back in the day, Reverend Falwell, Pat Robertson, all these guys, many of whom turned out to be real con artists and flakes, which was not true of my family. We were mistaken in a lot of ways, but not thieves. And we were not a criminal organization, as most big evangelical mega anything seem to be these days, or often have been. But it seems to me, as I look at the kind of people who follow Sojourners and are affected by your day-to-day work and might be the readers of this book, A More Perfect Union, cynicism is the wrong word, but burnt out might come closer to it. And so your message is, you involve a lot of Black Americans on the sort of professional level, and you have quotes of people endorsing your book, some of whom are friends of mine who are in that venue. But I think if you peel back a layer a little below that, you're dealing with a lot of white people, some of whom very much are in my age group, who came out of that environment, sort of burnt out, went away, and you're their Sojourners is their kind of last link with anything that might be called even halfway evangelical, if you still even want to use the term. So I want to ask you, as a leader of that organization, but also a spiritual question, because you're a pastor, what do you say to people who come from those backgrounds that make them feel like they're refugees and they're spending the rest of their lives getting the ringing out of their ears? They're done with the whole thing. How do you call any of that group to action and to involvement?
Yeah, so first, I would want to say and kind of ask for forgiveness on behalf of the church for the ways in which the church harmed so many of you and rejected so many of you. I think Sojourners tries to be a kind of, sanctuary, lifeline in some ways, vehicle for many people that have felt burned by the church for a whole series of reasons. And, we've always been ecumenical in our overall kind of charism and theology. We also, in part because of Jim's leadership and identification as an evangelical and coming out of that tradition, really tried to claim the evangelical label, but try to redeem it or try to transform it.
Yeah.
And, sadly, I think it's become so hijacked and so politicized that it's hard for me to see, in the short term at least, that it really could be rehabilitated. And so doesn't mean we don't stop trying, but I think Sojourners as a spiritual home, a religious home, really is going to be Christ-centric. And we're trying to draw people back into a relationship with Christ. And that relationship then enlists us in so many justice causes in the world. And so, I would really kind of center my own experience, particularly after college, being rooted in the Black church tradition. And the Black church tradition, by and large, is very evangelical, if you kind of look at many of the theological tenets of evangelicalism. But it doesn't carry with it a lot of the, more, unfortunately, racist trappings of white evangelicalism. And so I'm really hopeful that not only can Sojourners reach and resonate with folks like you, but also with a younger generation that identifies much more as spiritual but not religious. And what's the good news that I see is that most of those young people I meet still have a high regard for Jesus. They want to follow the Beatitudes of Jesus and many of the teachings of Jesus. But they've seen the hypocrisy, and they've seen the, oftentimes hatred of the church, and have walked away from that. So if Sojourners can kind of be that bridge, I think that's a really important role to play. And, I'm anxious to have a big tent, because ultimately, my desire is to see people have a strong personal redemptive relationship with Christ. And I'm deeply committed to the transformational work of justice in our nation and the world. And the Beloved Community vision really is not just a Christian vision. The strength of it is that it is a deeply civic vision and a multi-religious vision, which we can talk about more.
Yeah, that's a good answer. And of course, it is a generational shift, as people that come from my generation have sort of seen the slide where evangelicals used to be identified with people like Billy Graham and Wheaton College, and then it went through the mega church and the televangelist phase, then the slide into the hard right. And, as has been pointed out, even the white evangelical tradition included a lot of good things at one point in terms of the abolitionists and the people working on integration. And then there's, guys like Jim Wallis himself. One question I've always had for Jim and folks at Sojourners that I kind of pose to you, because it sounds to me like you're taking a slightly new direction, is I have felt for perhaps longer than some of my friends like Jim that the evangelical world and the terminology that describes it, the born again experience, the word evangelical itself, now carries so much fraught baggage with it that at a certain point, post-Trump and into vaccine rejection territory and QAnon and all the rest, I just don't understand how Sojourners or you are going to be able to stay in the good graces of the evangelical mainstream when that mainstream is now moved incredibly far right. I'll give you one example just locally. Gordon College, that is down the street from me here in north of Boston, had a change of administration at one point in what I'll call the Trump era, or the reaction to the Obama era, however you want to put it. And all of a sudden, a lot of professors who were more tolerant in their views of gay rights and so forth were gone. They wrote to President Obama and asked him to make an exception for them so they could still fire people who came out as gay. They took on the state of Massachusetts, eventually wanted to go to the Supreme Court with this. And all of a sudden, a college that might have had some Jim Wallaces in it, if I could put it that way, no longer had room for that point of view. And this is a main bastion of evangelicalism. And so, when you look at what's happening, I just wonder how whether Sojourners describes itself as evangelical anymore, or whether you have to spend so much time defining what you mean that the terminology itself almost becomes worthless at this point. Is that a problem to you, or doesn't it matter? Is this just semantics of an old guy who lived through the era, so I care about it?
No, I think it does still matter. I mean, I would say that Sojourners is more ecumenical than evangelical. Yeah. I haven't given up on reaching and trying to convert and persuade many evangelical Christians about, really embracing a more holistic Christ and a greater commitment to justice. That being said, I mean, there has been a retrenchment in many parts, not all, but many parts of the evangelical church that are quite worrisome, and they're aligning themselves with essentially a white Christian nationalism and with the cult of personality of Trump that I think are really antithetical to the teachings and the life of Jesus.
Yeah.
There are some hopeful signs, though. I mean, I think the article that created a lot of controversy that Christianity Today put out just before the election, that got them a lot of hot water, was a hopeful sign. I think, while I wish it had more impact and influence on the evangelical church, the National Association of Evangelicals, their current leadership is much more in lockstep with Sojourners, certainly than he has been in the past. They have a document called For the Health of the Nation, which is a really good document in so many different ways. And the challenge, though, is the majority of evangelicals in the pews haven't necessarily read it or fully internalized it. So I do think there's kind of a disconnect that we need to close between the kind of political evangelical movement and really name them as more of a political movement than anything else. I don't think it's deeply theological. It's much more political. And then there's just a lot of like evangelicals who may lean conservative, but are, much more apolitical, to be honest, out there, that, are supporters of organizations they used to work for, like World Vision, or that are connected to more of the reform movement, who I believe we have a chance to get them activated. And we need their voices to start speaking out against so many of the alarming things we see threatening our democracy right now.
Now, I want to dive into the book here a minute, A More Perfect Union. Adam Russell Taylor, here's the book, everybody. And I've got a couple places that I just picked out in the book and marked. I'm looking at something you put here. You're quoting somebody by the name of Hughes, or Richard T. Hughes, who wrote Myths, Myths, America Lives. Is that Myths, America Lives or Lives?
America Lives by?
Yeah. But anyway, you cite a couple things, and the reason I want to put them here in these bulleted points is because I was looking for something that kind of addresses what I think you're answering in this book, but also laying out. And here they are. The myth of a chosen nation, the notion that God Almighty chose the United States for a special mission in the world, the myth of nature's nation, the conviction that American ideals and institutions are rooted in the natural order, that is, in God's own intentions first revealed at the dawn of civilization, the myth of the millennial nation, the notion that the United States, building on that natural order, will usher in the final golden age for all humankind, the myth of a Christian nation, the claim that America is a Christian nation consistently guided by Christian values, the myth of the innocent nation, the conviction that while other nations may have blood on their hands, the nobility of the American cause always redeems the nation and renders it innocent. And I thought that was great that you included those bulleted points, because the only comment I would make is that those things are used by evangelicals in two ways. One, as statements of fact, and the other as a kind of an apologetic, saying, see, this proves Christianity is true. Look at all these great benefits we have in the West. My father used to include that in his apologetic, whether it was Northern European Reformation art that he loved or American democracy. Somehow these were the fruits of the gospel and made America unique in a very darkened world where we're more this shining light with this Christian background. So I'm glad you took that on, but it seems to me that those bulleted points are the kind of heartbeat of where the far right of the evangelical movement has gone in the next step, because you could have included another one. And I know this wasn't your writing, but you were summarizing somebody else's, but including it. And that was that Trump was somehow revealed by God as the leader who would restore all these things that are under attack from people like you and me, or quote unquote liberals or whomever. How do you feel about that? Don't you think that those encapsulate the sort of movement toward Trump? But would you add that other point that now the kind of Christian nationalism has adopted this thing? He really won the election. He was chosen by God, so he couldn't have lost. I mean, it's now gone out. Those are points you could argue with rationally. Now you could add a bullet point that there's no answer for, because it's not from this planet, if I could put it that way. How do you feel about that?
No, you're making a really good point. And part of the reason why I included that material, let me backtrack a little bit. So about 5 years ago, I started teaching as an adjunct professor very much things kind of coming full circle from how I mentioned I met Jim. So
Yeah.
I got an invitation by Pepperdine University. I don't get to go to Malibu, California, but I teach here in DC. They have a campus here. So I teach a class on religion and comparative politics. And I actually discovered Richard Hughes' book for the first time because it was an assigned reading for the course, and really loved his argument. And so in this class, I emphasize these myths, and I'm also often amazed at just how much they're new to our students, even though kind of subconsciously they know about them, but they haven't necessarily been taught a lot of this history.
Yeah.
So then I wrote in this book because I think you can't understand the rise of Trumpism, and you can't understand why 82% of white evangelicals voted for him, and the majority of white mainline Christians and white Catholics voted for him the first time.
Yes.
Unless you understand how these myths are woven into the psyche, the conscience, the kind of narrative of our country. Yeah. And it's important to name them as myths. I mean, you could say, use even stronger language, that they're lies, although I think there's some truth embedded in them.
Yeah.
But particularly the myth that we're a chosen nation, that we're an innocent nation.
Well, and the new Israel, if you want to come right down to it,
Right. Those have propped up a sense of American exceptionalism and triumphalism, and they give license to the kind of, I think, distorted theology that then would want to anoint Trump as the next Cyrus and see him as this kind of imperfect instrument of God's will.
Well, and did so, and you even have people who postured who posed at, or were at one point. I mean, there's this really crazy character, Metaxas, who is a sort of an evangelical intellectual who writes a book on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which, by the way, I take great issue with. I read it and did not think it was a very good biography for a lot of reasons, but that's a side issue. But who now go even further and condemn people who don't appreciate Trump as this Lord's anointed new Cyrus or whatever, or King David, as traitors to the United States. So that there's people within the evangelical movement who seem to have had a brain at one point, who have gone off at a tangent, which is almost unthinkable. So we're not just talking about an unwashed mob of people here, if you want to be caricature them. There's some evangelical leadership here that really surprises me, that's gone in that direction. I found it very surprising.
I do too, and I find it very alarming. And it makes me very worried because, again, unless we can get more of those moderate voices to speak out and to name that as really heretical and not Christian, I think more people are going to be swayed by some of those arguments.
Well, and back in the day when we were campaigning for Ronald Reagan and we knew the Bush family, my parents were staying in the Ford White House. I had Mike Ford living in my house for a year, babysitting my daughter, Jessica. I got my wife, Jeannie, pregnant when we were 17 and 18, and Mike and Gail Ford were staying with us at the time. And Jeannie and I have been together 52 years since, and everything going forward. And I do childcare for my 3 youngest grandchildren every day. But back in those days, it would have been impossible to think of even a right-wing conservative evangelical figure like my father or Billy Graham saying that a president had been chosen by God, and to vote against him would be voting against God's will. Nobody ever went there, even at the margins. I mean, it's unthinkable to think. There's so much unthinkable. You and me are in a fix. Where do you start? But just start there, that you have big-time evangelical leaders like Ralph Reed and Franklin Graham and Jerry Falwell Jr. before he fell afoul of his, dalliance and so forth and so on, going to the limit and actually talking about thus saith the Lord stuff. This is the chosen one. And they weren't kidding.
Yeah, no, it is alarming and it's dangerous. I think, my sense of hope in all of this is that we can persuade more Christians to start speaking out. I mean, I've had a lot of private conversations with people who are deeply distressed by January 6th and deeply distressed by the things you're talking about, but have remained, far too quiet. And so,
maybe they're terrified too, because even
there's risk involved, right? Yes, there's definitely risk involved. But
Speaking of which, though, let me just ask you a question sort of to the point, and that is, what about all those folks who are speaking out, but also earning a living from the big old evangelical God machine still? And okay, they may be terrified of the far right or whatever, but it just seems to me that, people who still want to get their books published by the big evangelical publishers and get invited to speak at Wheaton College or Gordon or whatever, can't stand up too vociferously on this stuff because, you know, the machine is into self-preservation more than principle. Now, that's a dark way to look at the evangelical world, but I think that's the case 99% of the time. Do you share my dark vision, or do you feel that I'm too cynical about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of truth to what you just said. And, you know, it's a moment, I think, of clarity and the need for clarity and courage. I mean, I think there are some voices that have been willing to speak out, even if it meant severing those contracts and ruining some of their credibility.
Yeah.
And we need to see more of it. We also need to challenge those institutions, whether it's Whedon or, you know,
any of these
publishing houses.
Yeah. Do you get it as president of Sojourners these days, post-Trump, knowing that, you know, huge chunks of the evangelical audience, if polls are to be believed, 70% of them believe Trump is the legitimate president and Biden shouldn't have been elected. They're going along with all these voter suppression regulations coming up through all these state houses. At what point does Sojourner no longer get any speakers invited to evangelical institutions because you aren't clearly pro, you know, that, pro the right, pro what's happening? I mean, do you see a shift there in terms of your own ability to talk to some of these folks, or do you still get invited places?
So I mean, it's still early. I have been invited in some spaces, particularly because I see myself as a bridge builder. I mean, that's something that I actively try to do, but not in a way that then compromises my core beliefs. I mean, I believe strongly in taking up your cross and counting the cost of that.
Yeah.
You know, what does it gain to gain the whole world but forfeit your soul? So, you know, I will try to be faithful to what I believe, but I'm also willing to engage in dialogue and want to engage in dialogue with people that have very different points of view than me. So, I mean, we continue to work with the Southern Baptists in different ways, work closely with the NAE, although the NAE is much more moderate.
Yeah.
And, you know, I hope that, you know, some of those institutions you name will invite me in at some point. I haven't, you know, things are a little different in the midst of COVID, so not a lot of invitations.
Yes, that's right. We're doing a lot on Zoom here.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But anyway, if any of them are listening to your podcast, I would welcome those invitations, because I think we desperately need to create more spaces for dialogue. And, you know, if we can't model that in, you know, our own kind of Christian way, how we expect our politics to be any better, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree. The other day I was interviewing Beth Allison Barr, who's written this book called The Making of Biblical Womanhood. And she's an evangelical, but her husband, who was a pastor, got fired from his evangelical church because his wife, who's an academic who teaches at Baylor, I believe, was writing all this stuff on a sort of biblical roots for feminism. And that alone was enough to get him canned from his church. So I think, you know, I think the times are fraught, and people of goodwill like you who still are leaving all the channels open, my sense is may be disappointed before this is all done. And then hopefully we come out the other side. You know, I'm not a pessimist in the long term. So let me get to another passage in your book and just take a look at something else I wanted to talk about that I think was really excellent. And I like this for a reason that's a little bit self-serving, because it ties in with a lot of work I've been doing recently. And that is, you write on, let's say, page 175, a comprehensive approach to poverty must include the following, more bulleted points here. It must address the breakdown of families by ameliorating the economic pressures that accelerate this breakdown. Well, as we speak here today, in our government, Congress, both the House and the Senate, is a huge discussion on whether they're even going to have, you know, paternity leave included in these bills and paid maternity leave. I mean, it's so funny because there's so much that leapt off the page in rereading sections of your book that I had marked the first time I went through it to look at with you today that sound like the list of things that Joe Biden's trying to get done this afternoon. Yeah. I mean, you know, it's just crazy. It's like, you know, you write it down here and it comes out there. We're living a historical moment that's insane. And it goes on here. It requires addressing of the changing nature of work due to automation and technology. Well, every headline in every newspaper in America today is the Great Resignation. People just saying, the hell with this, I'm done. Blue collar folks saying, I'm not doing $12 an hour anymore to work in your stinking box store or load grocery shelves and catch COVID while you all make money. And then on the other end, a lot of people like my son, John, who renegotiated his contract on a managerial level with a tech company saying, I'm coming in 1 day a week, and if you don't like it, I'll find another job. I'm working from home. I'm used to being home with my kids now. So we see a huge transition that is very much, right in the guts of your book. Like you're talking about it on a theoretical level. People are doing it, not as mass protest, but just, we're mad as hell and we're out of here. And it requires transforming our education system so that the quality of a child's education isn't tied to their zip code. It requires increasing access to jobs, partly by pursuing federal jobs program that build infrastructure, increase investment in low-income communities, and strengthen job training programs. All I'm trying to point out to folks who are thinking of reading this book is that far from just being a theoretical book by somebody who has a lot of training and has done interesting things, you actually happen to have written a book. I don't know when you were writing this, but it drops into the moment we're living in as a kind of rip from the headline stuff. I don't know whether you realized you were doing that. I just want to ask you, did you sort of, when did you close this book out in the process of COVID coming down the path? Because it seems to have some prophetic qualities to it.
Well, thank you. That's definitely a compliment. And that certainly was my hope. So I wrote a big chunk of the book about 3 years ago, and then did a lot of revising. Particularly, I feel like I could not put out the book after we'd been through the racial awakening summer 2 summers ago.
Yeah.
And we, COVID hit, and kind of a whole new way in which our reality was upended. And so I was able to kind of update many different parts of it. And it, originally was going to come out in January of this year, and they got postponed until September, which in some ways was providential, because I think it's a stronger book as a result.
Sure.
I would just emphasize that, a lot of those policy ideas and prescriptions comes out of 20 plus years of advocating for pretty much all of those provisions.
Yes, sure.
Sojourners have been working on those issues for a long time.
Yeah.
One in particular that we finally got a huge victory around in the rescue package was the child tax credit. We've been—
Yes, which by the way, let me just stop on that, because I think that's the best thing that ever happened. To the degree that you guys worked on it and had a lot to do with it, thank you from a grateful American, because this was great, and well done. More of the same, please.
Thank you. Yeah, and I appreciate that. And now, sadly, because the Build Back Better package has been pared down as a result of trying to compromise with Senator Manchin and Sinema to $1.75 trillion. Right now in the proposal, there's only a 1-year extension to the child tax credit, which is certainly better than nothing. But that needs to become a permanent fixture of our social safety net, because it's one of the most effective ways to lift children out of the quicksand of poverty. Yeah. And what frustrates me the most in the kind of debate about this is that this is the most pro-family, pro-children agenda we have seen since the Great Society. Yeah. And yet, there is a wall of opposition from Republicans. The religious right has been pretty much silent, if not critical. Yeah. And, what is more pro-family than enabling a mother or a husband to be able to get paid family leave so that they can have the support they need to care for their kid? What's more pro-family than a child tax credit, or ensuring that working families can afford childcare? And so, I've really tried to frame it that way, and, it hasn't always broken through, but I will continue to speak out about just how pro-family, which means, this is pro-human dignity, pro-Imago Dei, and there's lots of different ways to root this in our religious sensibilities and convictions. And, I'm proud that Sojourners has been a part of a much broader coalition called the Circle of Protection that has really fought hard to keep those provisions in the bill and try to keep the bill as ambitious as possible. And so, we're kind of, maybe we're at the 5-yard line. We're so close to scoring this thing, but I'm pretty hopeful that within the next month, we'll see it passed.
Yeah, and I think the point you bring up is really good. And that is obviously any claim to being pro-family, pro-life, pro-woman, pro-charity, pro-anything when it comes to dignity of individuals just evaporates if you can't get behind something like a child tax credit or paid family leave. We want people to have babies, right? So we tell them not to have an abortion, and then when they try to have a child, we're saying, now get back to the office next week and you're on your own. The level of hypocrisy is just amazing. But I think that your book, in touching on these points, is almost like a kind of a reference point for folks. A little further on, you talk about in making a case for his new economics, Hanor suggests that, but again, these bullet points jump out of your book. Economic growth is created primarily by people and not simply by capital. Reciprocity promotes the public good, not simply self-interest, and cooperation, not purely competition, produces our prosperity. And, you know, I've done a lot of reading in the last 5.5 years on a project that I've been working on, which we're not here to promote today, with a new book of mine that's coming out. But what was interesting to me is I have sciencey friends who teach at university level who've been reading this manuscript back and forth, and they've been sending me wonderful things to read on evolution and psychology and so on and so forth. But a term which has come into the scientific field in the last 20 years and now is a big deal is the survival of the friendliest, replacing the survival of the fittest. And this is not me making this up because it sounds nice or Jesus said it or something. This is like hard science now. And it has to do with actual evolutionary survival. Why are any of us here? And we're here because we have caregivers in our past. If everybody was a rapist and a pillager and a killer and a exploiter, none of us would be here. So it's also kind of an optimistic note about the direction of human life, that any of us have survived is sort of an optimistic point on our future. But what I like so much about that passage in your book is it's sort of a list of things that could be put under the heading of the survival of the friendliest. So I just wondered if you've run into that term, because it's out there.
No, I actually haven't, but I'm glad you shared it, because I really like it, and it's a good way of framing it. I mean, I think another important way of kind of framing the kind of economy we need is a restorative economy. This kind of gets into the environmental challenges we're facing. Yeah. And we need to break out of this zero-sum, limited good mentality, which is just crippling our politics, probably because in the United States context, it has become so racialized. You know, any gains or advance of a different or non-white group must come at my own expense. And that is just not the way the economy needs to work, nor, you know, has to work, and certainly is not the economy that is in line with, I believe, God's vision of shalom and of wholeness and of liberation. So yeah, I would love to learn more about that. And
yeah, it's interesting because two of the scientists who've done the most work on this are at Cornell, and they're studying dog evolution and psychology, and they find that, you know, dogs and humans co-evolved together starting probably a little more than 50,000 years ago. They used to think it was like 35,000 years. Now they're saying it's earlier, to the point where, by the way, we share some cancers that no other mammals share with dogs. I mean, it's crazy. There's a symbiotic relationship that's insane. And one of the things is, you know, you have this predator who is skulking around your cave, you know, and at some point, somebody threw it a bone and it came into the firelight. And then this relationship starts developing. The most hunted predator, an enemy of all humans, suddenly becomes this amazing creature that protects you, sleeps in your bed if it's like Zip, my little dog that I can't get to sleep with unless he's on my bed these days. And they look at this and they're saying the fact is that actually humans evolved the same way. And the reason that dogs and humans bonded in such a close way is that both they had this sort of relationship based on the fact of tolerating each other. And then, of course, the whole hunter-gatherer thing, that no hunter-gatherer tribe survives without sharing. And then when it comes to gender roles, you know, we have this idea that men go to work and women are supposed to be home, blah, blah, blah. But of course, this is a modern phenomenon, because when you go back to hunter-gathering and or the family farm in history, you have men and women's roles interchangeable, elderly people helping with the toddlers. And it is a survival of the friendliest paradigm, and this is why we're here. So there's a lot of study on it, and I've had a great deal of pleasure digging into it. So let me ask you, swing back before I get to another quote in the book on something personal. What did you do during the lockdowns? Where were you? Where were your kids?
So, you know, we were certainly fortunate in lots of ways. We were at our home in Silver Spring, Maryland. I had a really frenetic travel schedule planned that just got completely halted. Actually, you know, one of the things I've learned in this pandemic is that I never want to go back to that kind of travel schedule that I had before. And I think I'm going to be a lot more discerning about what I say yes to. Yes. And so, you know, the experience at first was virtual school, which I think any parent can tell you made you want to pull your hair out. I'm certainly glad it was better than no school at all. But, you know, at that time, you know, my younger son was like 6 and was, his attention span is not extremely long, particularly then.
Yeah.
But we were able to kind of overcome a lot of that. And the one thing that I absolutely think is just was such a blessing is it's not big, we have a kind of tiny little backyard that is like a perfect rectangle. So it's great for playing soccer. I would go out there and do PE with my kids every day, and just like having that fresh air. Obviously we can go on walks and we did hikes and other things, but just being right in that space, being able to do things with my kids was just really a blessing. But yeah, we really rediscovered the outdoors and got back into hiking, discovered a lot more trails around the DC area. I think the hardest thing for me, I'm like a real mixture between an extrovert and an introvert. And that extrovert side of me is just really suffering, particularly because I had really hoped and planned to reopen our office, which is really close to Capitol Hill, after Labor Day. And then the Delta variant hit, and it just didn't feel like the benefits outweigh the risks and costs. And so we're now looking at, the new year, beginning of the new year, when we're going to start reopening. But
having been forced to spend a little more time with your kids, you kind of discovered a little bit. The 3 grandchildren that I've been doing childcare for the last 12 years since Lucy was born, 13 years now with her. I have 5 grandchildren, but 3 live literally across the street. So we all just sheltered together. And it was kind of like a reparenting experience for me, because back when my kids were the age your kids are now, and I was closer to your age, although I was a much younger father because of my insane teen pregnancy adventure with Jeannie. But that said, I was on the road 6 months of the year doing stuff. And I look back with nothing but sort of a hazy regret, thinking, what was all that about? I don't even remember what those big, fancy, important meetings were. But every day I'm with my granddaughter, Nora, I pick her up at school, I bring her back, I cook for her, I do stuff. I mean, these are irreplaceable sort of moments. So as I look back, it's not with bitter regret as in I ruined my life, but it's, man, where was my head at? Or who was giving me any actual good life advice instead of all this striving and doing and so on. And, and if it's in a good cause, quote unquote, it's even worse, because then you can justify any kind of being away. And I get incredible pleasure. I think there are a lot of people who have been forced to stay home or waking up today saying, you know what, I don't think I want to go back to quote normal. I mean, what do you think about that?
I think that's really important. I mean, we shouldn't go back to a really broken normal.
Yeah.
We need to create a new normal, abnormal, however you want to describe it. And that's true both in terms of like family life and how we prioritize and center our kids and our wives and our families, but also just in terms of the degree to which the pandemic just pulled back the curtain on so much inequality and injustice that we knew that was there.
Yes.
But the degree to which it's revealed such huge racial disparities in health. African Americans have been 3 or 4 times more likely to contract and then get killed of COVID-19.
Yeah.
Similar disproportionate rates for Latinos and even for Asian Americans.
Yeah.
So, to
me,
and
the way women have been hammered with career and childcare and stuff, I mean, they took it in the neck far harder than males did.
Right.
I mean,
that's right. And everyone that was, almost overnight now deemed essential, whereas they were kind of ignored and mistreated in the past.
Yes.
And now those same people are kind of realizing that, hey, working for kind of a poverty wage in a job that's putting my life at risk really isn't worth it. And, I think that there just has to be a real reevaluation of our priorities and a kind of restructuring of our economy. And certainly, some of the steps we talked about earlier through Build Back Better are really important steps in that direction. But I think we need even a more fundamental kind of reimagination of what our life should look like going forward.
Yeah, and I think one of the things is that, I tend to look at feminism as an evolutionary step, like opposable thumbs or losing your tail, or all of us walking out of Africa upright at one point when we were coming off that continent and spreading out across the globe. Now we have this idea that somehow that it's more traditional for men not to be caregivers. And yet again, some of the studying I've been doing for my new book, very interesting and informative, a lot of stuff having been done in Israel and here in the U.S., at Columbia and other places, showing that men develop exactly the same neural pathways and or hormonal reactions as women do. And now with brain scans and the modern technology, we're able to measure that. So for instance, a gay father with an adoptive child has the same rush of hormones, oxytocin, brain scan pieces lighting up as a mother breastfeeding a child. So that the researchers were really surprised because they were doing the men as a sort of a control. They were studying women. They did the men as a control. And then they started finding something intriguing, switched their studies. Wow. Males did evolve to be caregivers. So this idea that somehow our roles are very clearly defined, male and female, and that somehow feminism is this new thing is the exact opposite. Actually, it's the other way around. And that is, it's never been women care for children and men do something else. It's that, it really does take a village. And only in this weird shareholders and profits and GDP first and everything else second world where we're defined by career and not by our human relationships have we gotten into this crazy treadmill where all of a sudden it's a woman's job to take care of children and men are off doing, quote, the big important things. And if women want to join them, they've got to pretend like they don't have families either. My daughter's a CEO of a company in New York, and she's gets so sick of the fact that the women she works with somehow have to lie. They have to pretend, no, we're not doing a school pickup, we're at the office, or, almost like if you admit you have a family, then you're dangerous. And I think the new normal has got to include men realizing it's not a question of stepping up to do the right thing. It's a question of don't throw away the candy and eat the wrapper. The good stuff is the human relationships. I don't know, I'm sure you've done some thinking about that.
Yeah, I think that there is this incredibly important opportunity to reimagine, but also reweave how we think about community and relationships. And that's part of the heart of the book is, I try to cast this moral vision, which is an old one in the sense that it comes out of the civil rights movement, it even predates that. A theologian named Josiah Royce really coined the term the beloved community, but King really popularized it and put it in the popular imagination, the moral imagination. And what I argue in this book is that, we are hardwired to yearn for relationship and community.
Yes.
We're also hardwired to often move in a direction of division, that fear and hatred are also such powerful motivators.
Yeah, I'm pushing the fear of the other.
Yeah, exactly right. That's exactly right. And so, I basically make the argument that our nation in particular desperately needs a shared moral vision and story that both reckons with how we've gotten to where we are, because the past so often shapes and shows up in the present and the future, and that has kind of a shared vision for where we want to go as a nation that is rooted in our deepest religious and civic values. And so the beloved community to me is the most powerful and most inspirational vision that I think could unify us across many of our generational differences, racial differences, religious differences, et cetera. And, my kind of remixed version of it, building on Dr. King, is building a society where everyone is seen, everyone is valued and respected, where everyone can thrive and realize their full potential. And in a policy way, it's building a society where neither punishment nor privilege is viciously tied to race, to ethnicity, to gender, to ableness, to sexual orientation, et cetera. And that's a pretty big bar. Yes. But I actually think it's a bar that is rooted in the Constitution of the United States, and it's rooted in so many of our religious traditions and our kind of humanitarian commitments. And so that is the kind of vision for the community that I think we want to become, that we so desperately need. And the good news that I try to highlight in this book, particularly in the third part, is that there are glimpses of the beloved community being built all around us.
Yes.
I tell all kinds of stories in the book about that, and I unpack what the beloved community looks like into 6 principles, essentially, or commitments that I call the Beatitudes. So a commitment to imago Dei equality, a commitment to radical welcome, a commitment to prioritizing nonviolence, a commitment to environmental stewardship, and a commitment to dignity for all. And then lastly, a commitment to what I call Ubuntu interdependence, which literally is all about community. So I definitely hope this book can be this kind of catalyst for what we're talking about.
Yeah, one way to describe a more perfect union would be to say, listen, if you sort of are going to reject the tyranny of Ayn Rand and the Superman, alone, individualistic, striving, crush others, This is the antidote. But let me go to one more last thing here in the book I wanted to share with people before we close this out. And it's funny, I just got to prove to you, I already had it. You didn't see me using a pencil, so you know that I'm not doing this because of what you just said. I was prepared, okay? And this is not first. I don't want you to think that I'm...
No convincing needed.
Yeah, we did not collude on this. Toward the end of the book, you say, the journey of building the beloved community will be a hard one, requiring sacrifice, vigilance, and courage, but it will not be defined purely around struggle. The pursuit of the beloved community will also be filled with great joy, and in it we will find deeper purpose, belonging, and meaning. That's why it is worth pursuing, because the fruits of human flourishing, right relationship, and thriving communities are unlocked and experienced in the very acts of building the beloved community. And I love that. And it's toward the end of the book and really sums up the purpose of the book. And I just want to say to anybody watching this in conversation with Frank Schaeffer and or listening, you really need to run out and get Adam's book, because it's a really important book. That term gets thrown around a lot, but this is really important in itself, irrespective of the fact Adam's running an organization that's important, has played a great part in our nation's life now for the better part of 50 years. So I would urge you all to take this book seriously, get in touch with Sojourners. And by the way, Adam, we will list all the connection stuff. Anybody wants to get in touch with you or Sojourners or help out or do anything, we'll get it all and put it all up anywhere this goes, so people will be able to find you. So let me remind you that you've been listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Please subscribe to this podcast and help us, not financially, we're not asking for donations, but by subscribing, you help us get more people like Adam, Russell, Taylor, bringing good news to us, author of A More Perfect Union, talking about community and what really matters and human relationships, replacing this kind of striving, hard-nosed culture we've got with a different way of looking at things. So thank you so much for being with us today, Adam. And you let us know, or me know, if there's anything that we can ever do to serve you. And God bless you and your family. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. This was great. Really enjoyed it.
Me too.
And yes, let's stay in touch. We'd love to.
Yeah, I'd love to. And I live in Boston, and you're not too far away. And one day when we're all traveling more easily, we will do something together. But I look forward to seeing you, and we'll sit down and have a cup of coffee sometime. That was pretty good, though. We had a good talk.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, I love that. And I'm overdue for a trip to Boston, so let you know.
Well, come on up here, and you know how to reach me. So be my guest anytime you're in the area. I'll come pick you up.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.